I'm very much interested in both market research and politics. It's consumed a fair bit of my working life, and so it's a real delight to be able to introduce our two speakers here now. Stephen I've known since he was David Longy, Prime Minister's political poll advisor in the 1980s. And David I've known, we've worked together for Jenny Shipley and Bill English. Both left Parliament to establish very successful careers in market research. Stephen leading UMR research and David Courier research. They represent the left and the right. And given that we as insurers and others related to our industry have a keen interest in the outcome of elections in terms of the regulatory environment in which we have to operate, and we've had a lot of comment through the course of this morning about how important that is to get the right balance in place in terms of protection of the policyholder and ensuring the right amount of capital is available to provide the vital insurance that we need. We need to have a good look at what may or may not happen. So we're going to start off with Stephen Mills. Stephen will take the left-hand corner, and his focus will be, I think, to look at where things are at this time in the electoral cycle, looking ahead 12 months ahead. We have to have an election by November next year, and he's been involved in state elections across Australia, federal elections across Australia and New Zealand elections for the past 25 years, so has some very good, deep insights on that. And David will then speak about the minor parties, and as we know, you can't have a major party in office, or it's highly unlikely, without the minor parties. So he'll be giving us insights on the minor parties, a slightly different focus, but ultimately both come together. We'll ask, in fairness, for Stephen to have a comment for a minute or two on David's presentation, and then we'll replicate with David having a minute or two on Stephen's, and from then on, it'll be open to the floor. So, without further ado, could I ask you to welcome Stephen Mills and David Farrar, and with a bit of a clap, and Stephen Mills.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. What I'm going to do, hopefully this will come up, is just give a really kind of brutally brief overview of the political climate. We're going to have just a little bit of look behind the numbers as well as at the political fundamentals in terms of giving some kind of hints, direction as to what's going to happen in 2014 election. Now, I do quite a few of these, and up to about 2 to 3 months ago, my summary line at the end of them was that the election was very much the centre-left's to lose. That gave me a bit of necessary wiggle room, as it was quite possible for the centre-left to find a way to lose it. But it starts from the premise that the last election was really, really close, in that there were really only a few thousand votes in it which determined that the Maori Party had a decision between backing the government or going into opposition or backing National Labour. Now, if the choice had been backing National or Labour, I think they would have gone National, so John Key would have become Prime Minister even if a few thousand votes had landed differently. But it would have been a tough choice for them because while their electorate voters obviously vote for the Maori Party, most of those in their party vote for Labour. And when you ask those Maori Party voters, we have a running question and we aggregate the results of which government they'd like to see, a National-led or a Labour-led government. They do, by a vast majority, say a Labour-led government. So it would have been a big call for the Maori Party leadership to go with National. Now, that would have been a surprise result, and I think if Phil Goff had ended up being Prime Minister at the head of a Labour, Green, New Zealand First, Maori, Mana government, there would have been rioting in Remuera, in North Shore, and probably in a few provincial cities as well. But it was kind of that close, and I think that's what the starting point we need to remember looking forward to the 2014 election. And then when I looked at the numbers up to really a few months ago, all the kind of ratings for National were well down on what they were in their first term. All the ratings for Labour were quite a bit up, even on leadership, than they were in the 2008 to 2011 period. And it seemed to me that that conclusion that, the centre-left really did have the election in their hands, and if they kind of executed competently, they would win, was a reasonable conclusion. But in the last few months, things have changed. Primarily, what's happening, I think, is economic confidence is strengthening, and people are breaking out of what's been a sluggish, sullen mood about the economy that's prevailed really since the shock of the global financial crisis has eased into a more positive frame. And secondly, and I think this is more of a minor thing, but not as important, but National's political management has unquestionably improved over the last few months. So I'm really at the very craven position now of saying that the 2014 election is really too close to call, and I'll take you through why I've reached that conclusion. Okay, just to start with, just going to run through, just really as a bit of background. We have a omnibus survey that's in the field every 2 weeks, and we ask the level of interest in the sort of 5 or 6 major news stories that have prevailed in that previous 2 weeks. And as you can see there, the main ones of the highest level of interest declared this year has been in the earthquakes that hit Wellington and Nelson, which I guess is an issue for you guys, the drought maybe as well, and the Boston Marathon bombings, which would have been an issue, I guess, for your American comrades. So the key point there is there's not a lot of politics, and the next slide shows you the top political stories of 2013. You can see there that they're quite a surprise to people when I show them this, that the ones that the most declared interest in are very much kind of stories affecting people rather than the dramas of leadership and big issues and so on. They were the breakfast in schools, the changes to mortgage conditions, and the school closures in Christchurch. John Key declared that the snapper quota was more important to New Zealanders than the GCSB fuss, which isn't kind of backed up by our data, though he may have been right in terms of people prepared to change their votes on the issue, but there was higher declared interest in the spy stories, which ran for a few months. Okay, moving on to the vote. This is just a comparison between the election and our very latest poll, which was done over the weekend of the Labor Party conference. So it started on Thursday. Most of the interviewing was done on the Saturday and Sunday, and some on the Monday as well. So it kind of caught the publicity for the conference. But the pattern there has been kind of apparent in other polls as well, that since that election, there's been an increase in support for the centre-left parties. Labor up from the very low 27.5% it got at the election to 34.7%, and the Greens up 1% as well. And so it's about 8% in total, and it's about a 5 to 6% decline for the centre-right. If we look at this month by month, you can see there the pattern throughout the year where there was quite a low point for National in April and May, and also quite a high point for Labor at the culmination of the leadership contest. It was a very interesting thing. It's the first time we've ever seen that in New Zealand, of course, in that normally there's a caucus vote and bang, and there's a new leader. But with that process, we actually did a poll during the period that Labor didn't have a leader, and its vote went up during that time. I think you'll see that in the future as well. It's not. Well, David Shear was actually in a reasonable position beforehand, but the vote increased with the way that was conducted. Just in terms of what you guys might be interested in, and this can't be taken too seriously, but I had a look at our numbers from the surveys completed prior to the 6 o'clock news on Saturday night, when David Cunliffe made the announcement of the new kind of insurance company that a centre-left government's going to set up, and looked at the numbers after that. And as I say, you can't take it too seriously because there's quotas, the different regions, we're chasing people. It's not, they're not apples and apples comparisons, but there was pretty much no difference between the vote before or after. So you can be encouraged that that didn't sort of lead to a massive lift in the Labor vote, or discouraged that it didn't lead to a massive fall in the Labor vote. But I think the impact of that policy will be clearer over the next 2 or 3 surveys rather than this one. Okay, the vote share left versus right, this is of course what really matters, and as you can see it is dead close. Since the 2011 election, the centre-left and centre-right blocks have been pretty much locked together, and if there have been breakouts, they've been for the centre-left. There was one around April and May, which was pretty much, I think, based on the education problems National was having, multiple sort of issues with the minister, and also the whole Kim.com GCSB thing, which touched John Key a bit. You know, he got into some personal difficulties on that as well, and there was a clear centre-left majorities during that period briefly. National kind of got its act together during the from the budget onwards, and then that jump towards the end where the centre-left's in charge again, that seems to have been driven by the Labour leadership contest and the sort of first honeymoon for David Cunliffe, and that eased back in our latest poll, so getting back towards that really dead close line between the centre-left and the centre-right. Now, I put a slide in here on the Conservative Party. Given the attention it got, I think it was something of a beat-up really by the TV3 poll, but there is kind of signs that the Conservative Party could get 3, maybe even 4% with the following wind if it is given an electorate. Very tricky exercise giving a minor party an electorate. Caused massive negative publicity for John Key. In fact, it led to quite a significant drop in his personal ratings, the whole fallout from the John Banks cup of tea last time, so there's risks attached. But you can see there that at times the Conservative Party has hit reasonable numbers. It did get 2.7% in the election, you know, from almost nowhere, backed by a lot of money, but still reasonably impressive number. And we've had them over 3% a couple of times. Interestingly, that was around the time of the legislation for the same-sex marriage, where he was getting pilloried, and then he made what was seen, I guess, in the mainstream media to be a total fool of himself by threatening to sue the satiric blog, The Civilian. But it did get his name in lights in his actual poll numbers. Colin Craig, the Conservative Party's numbers increased, even though the publicity seemed to be negative rather than positive at that time. I don't think it's always a case that any publicity is good publicity, but it did seem to be the case for the Conservatives. And it'd be also interesting to see if they do get on a little bit of a roll, having been given this push by TV3's presentation of their survey, you know, and John Key's musings on the issue. They may, you know, get a bit of momentum as well. Okay, this next slide kind of comes down to the crunch really about, you know, what would be the shape of a government on the polls we've done since the last election. Now, this first half of the slide here, this is the kind of absolutely standard assumptions, which is what television makes every time, which is that you've got to get 5% to be in Parliament, or you've got to win an electorate seat. And then they also make the assumption that the existing electorate seat holders will hold them, that the Maori Party will hold their 3 seats, that ACT will hold Epsom, and that Peter Dunn will hold Oharu Belmont. So there's what comes through there, and you can see there that on that assumption, a lot of the time, those numbers there, the left majority, is because Winston Peters is coming in at 4.5, 4.6, so that says he's not going to be in Parliament. The votes get redistributed, and that carries a narrow centre-left lead over. They'll be very close, but you know, recently you can see there the switch from the Maori Party deciding through to more centre-left majorities. However, if you change those assumptions to what I think are more realistic ones, and the problem here is you can make a lot of them and they kind of tweak things, but the ones we made a few months ago when we decided to adapt this was that if New Zealand First is on 4% going into the election, they will get over the line. I don't think sort of anybody in the political community doubts that if Winston Peters, it may even be lower, even sort of 3.5%, that if he goes into an election campaign at that kind of number, he will find a way of coming out with 5 or more. You know, so that's assuming that he can get there. We assume that ACT and United Future will lose their seats. It may not be so obvious for United Future as it was from the time we decided this, when Peter Dunn was having some, you know, quite spectacular publicity about his texting and leaking of documents and so on. So, but it wouldn't change things greatly, and you could also argue that the Maori Party might only hold 2 rather than 3 seats. But, you know, they're working assumptions in terms of changing it. And also it doesn't obviously have in the Conservatives winning a seat and bringing in, say, 3% or something like that as well. But you can see there, if you make that assumption, that the person who emerges as the kingmaker in New Zealand politics in almost all our recent polls once more is Winston Peters. So he'll be the one who decides between National and Labour. And if you leave aside the high-risk electorate seat surrender strategy for National, you know, National's clear pathway to government, to stay in government, is to do what would have perhaps seemed unthinkable a few years ago, and that is to form some kind of arrangement with New Zealand First. Next slide, this is going back into kind of the fundamentals, and we do look kind of behind the numbers a bit to sort of in terms of understanding where we're going. So it didn't come up. And that tracks the annual average vote. So going back to 1997, we've got this data going back a few more years as well when, Alliance and parties like that were part of it. You can see there a couple of things to note. One is the rise of the Greens, that they have, steadily increased their presence in New Zealand politics. I think if the Labour Party has its sort of act together, that David Cunliffe performs well next year, that Green vote will fall down a bit. That I think there is an element of that which is kind of a centre-left swill vote, and it'll go back to Labour if Labour's looking like it can get into government. But even so, you can see there that they're becoming a solid, established presence in politics, a serious double-figure party. You can see the Helen Clark era, and the spectacular recovery between 2003 and 2004, which was driven by Don Brash's Orewa speech on race and subsequent events. And then the John Key era, more spectacular than what Helen Clark achieved, some really big gaps in numbers there. And then it's come down quite a bump in 2012. But just in terms of this conclusion about how things I think have kind of veered a bit back more to the centre-right in the last few months, those numbers have steadied this year rather than that downward trend continuing. Okay, next one is this chart here tracks the mood. We asked New Zealanders whether they think the country's heading in the right track or the wrong track. You can see they're pretty healthy numbers for an incumbent government. And as kind of confidence, it's been a little bit patchy, but you can see there's generally been a positive trend over the last few months. And that number, 58% thinking the country's heading in the right direction, 34% in the wrong direction, is a high for the year. Okay, the next one here, this, like with the vote a couple of slides back, looks at the annual average. So we're looking at the annual average for this right track, wrong track indicator, going back in this case to 1991. You can see what happens there is that when there's a change in government, which there was in 1990, there's this big surge in the right track, and then again in 1999, and then again in 2008. And then what happens is the jaws start to close on the incumbent government, that number starts to go down. I was a bit confused in 1996 there in that there was actually a mood for change there, but Winston Peters pulled over a lot of voters into a national-led coalition. But eventually the jaws had their say in 1999 when the numbers are about 42 all. Helen Clark lost government to John Key in 2008. The numbers were 47 right track, 42 wrong track. And last year you can see that the numbers are starting to get closer together, 52-37. So if that trend had continued, you'd have to say that what the fundamentals were indicating was that there would be a change in government in 2014. But as you can see in this next slide, which adds on the 2013 data, there's just signs there that National is wriggling free of those kind of iron jaws closing on it, the kind of ultimate fundamental trend of confidence in the country's direction. Economic confidence, the next one. This just asks whether people would think the economy would be better or worse in a year ahead. And you can see there 51% in the last reading think it'll be better, 27% worse. And again, while patchy, there is a very clear positive trend from about the middle of last year in terms of increasing economic confidence. And I think that's the thing that is changing the political settings a moment and getting me to retreat from a centre-left call to a too close to call. Overall performance of the national-led government, these are pretty good numbers as well. They're well down on the numbers in the first term when it was in the mid to high 70s a lot of times, absolutely phenomenal number, but a 59% approval of the overall performance of a government is pretty reasonable after 5 years. John Key's favourability. This is clearly critical to the government's prospects. He's very much the total face of the government. You can see there that he'd come down pretty steadily actually from extraordinary highs in his first term. I've worked a lot in Australia and there's been some utterly shameless populist state premiers there who do sort of anything to get votes and lift their ratings. And none of them ever got that high, So an 81% favourability rating for a leader of a political party was an extraordinary achievement. And And then it started to come down, and it's just edged up again in the last 2 or 3 months, in line with these other indicators which are more positive for the government. But I'll show you something here, this next one. This kind of tells you quite an interesting story here. This compares John Key's favourability rating, that's the darker lines, and Helen Clark's favourability rating, the lighter of the lines. Now, those Helen Clark numbers are in her 3rd term, and John Key's numbers are in his 2nd term. And you can see there that what you can conclude from that they're tracking incredibly closely, is that his numbers now are not at a level that automatically determines that he will stay in power. That those numbers were not enough to save Helen Clark, and those numbers will not necessarily now, he's come back to human levels, those numbers now are not necessarily enough to save John Key. Now, immediate point that can be made is that the comparison is what is important, that Helen Clark, even with those numbers, had John Key coming at her, and John Key's got David Cunliffe coming at him. But I think that's yet to be seen, that David Cunliffe may prove to be as formidable as John Key was as an opposition leader in election year next year. But at sort of, when John Key's numbers were sort of 75-20, there was no question that that was going to lead to at least National getting pretty close to 50%. At kind of more mid-50s, late 50s, it is that is a number that an opposition can compete with. Here's David Cunliffe's. There's just a little thing there. That's really just kind of reinforcing that point of how similar they've been. That Helen Clark's peak rating in her time in government was 78 positive, 20 negative, and John Key managed higher than that, 81 15. That was 4 years ago now. And Helen Clark's lowest rating was about 4 or 5 months before she lost, 53-45, and John Key's lowest rating in September this year was 52-43. So pretty similar. Here's David Cunliffe's favourability, just 2 readings so far, and he improved from the one taken immediately after becoming leader to one taken over the period of the Labor Party conference. So 44 positive, 27 negative. That's a pretty reasonable number, and 29% unsure, and how they break is obviously going to be important. Expectations of the result. Now, this is another indicator which some people say is the only one that matters. It's sort of, the kind of wisdom of crowds, prediction market methodology that, until that changes, National's going to win no matter what the other numbers say, leader ratings and vote shares and so on. So despite the polls being incredibly close or on balance favouring, up to the last couple of months, favouring the centre-left, there's still a pretty strong expectation that National will stay in government. So for those who believe in the wisdom of crowds, that's another positive indicator for the government. But here's a negative one. Does the government deserve to be re-elected, or is it time to give some other party a go? Now, the numbers there aren't so good for the government. 39% in our latest reading say deserves to be re-elected, 52% time for some other party to have a go. Now, under a first-past-the-post system, that would probably be fatal. It's not under MMP, because your coalition partners may think it's time for another party, but they're still going to end up supporting you. But what that shows is